Good morning, everyone. I'm joined by Susan McKenzie of the Ontario Alliance Against School Closures and Judy Keeling, who is a concerned parent, here to share their voice and their concerns and their experiences around closure of our good community schools. I'm Lisa Gretzky. I'm the MPP for Windsor West and the NDP Education Critic, and I want to thank everyone for coming here this morning. We've come together because of the rampant closure of good community schools across the province, and our education system has reached a tipping point. It's time for change. The Premier promised not to cut education, but she's broken that promise to families. Years of neglect have caused the accumulation of a capital repair backlog of $14 billion. And to put that in perspective, that's $14 billion that the school boards don't have in order to repair or upkeep the schools that our children are attending. Classrooms are sweltering in the summer and freezing in the winter. Our children should not be trying to learn in classrooms without windows or classrooms with poor air quality. Rather than adequately addressing these issues and ensuring the future of our good community schools, this government would rather board up our schools. The Geographic Circumstances Grant was cut by $10 million over the last 2 years. Base top-up funding, money that recognizes that schools are used for more than housing students, is being phased out. This funding was cut by nearly 1/3 in 2015-2016, sending shockwaves through communities across Ontario. What the Premier doesn't understand is that to people living throughout the province, community schools are more than a sum of building materials, pipes and boilers. They are more than just bricks and mortar. They are our parks and our green spaces, our community centers, and often the centerpieces of both urban and rural communities. When a school closes, we lose a generation of community traditions. Community input must be at the center of the decision-making process on the future of our schools. But this government is fast-tracking the process to close schools and limiting community input. Last year, the pupil accommodation review guidelines were redrawn to cut communities out of the decision-making process. These guidelines outline the minimum standard process that governs how school boards conduct reviews to determine the future of our local schools. This Liberal government cut the number of public meetings required before a school can be closed by nearly half. They also created a loophole to eliminate consultations by a community committee. In situations where the accommodation decisions are considered to be less complex, boards can now undertake a modified process involving an initial staff report, one public meeting, and a final staff report. No accommodation review committee will be established during the modified process, and it will be completed in just 2 months. Rural schools have been particularly impacted by this government's campaign of school closures. Already, our rural students have less access to music, health programs, and library services when compared to their urban counterparts. With the onslaught of rural school closures, these students will have even less opportunities to participate in areas like extracurriculars as they are bused hours outside of their town to the closest school. Location should not determine the quality of education and supports a child receives. Rural communities have distinct histories and traditions that are lost each time they lose their elementary or high school. School closures can no longer be forced to meet the government's bottom line. This government should be focused on creating community hubs, but instead they're limiting community participation and clearing the way for even more school closures. Decisions about local schools must always be made with the best interest of each child and the community in mind. The current funding formula was implemented by the Conservative Party under the leadership of Mike Harris. When it was implemented, the Liberals opposed the change, recognizing the serious problems and inequities it would create in the education system. Since forming government in 2003, the Liberals not only continue to use the funding formula they once strongly opposed, they even defend it. Decades of chronic underfunding of our public education system has resulted in reduced programming and resources for students, crumbling infrastructure, and alarming numbers of good community schools being closed with limited input from families, community members, and municipalities. The Premier and her government set up a panel to review the possibility of schools being utilized as community hubs. The public thought this was to give school boards a real opportunity to investigate and seek out community partners in order to keep our good community schools open. Clearly, families have been let down. The new pupil accommodation review guidelines set out by the Liberal government contradicts the idea of seeking creative ideas and community partnerships to keep our good community schools open. In fact, it fast-tracks the closure of schools, limits the options available to school boards, and stifles the voice of families and potential community partners. The Premier was once opposed to community school closures. Why does she now believe it's acceptable to silence the voice of those affected by loss of good community schools and fast-track the closure process? Today, I am lending my voice to the panel here and the others that will join us on the front lawn of the legislature this afternoon. We are unified in calling for a halt to the closure of good community schools until a review of the revisions to the pupil accommodation review guidelines are complete and accurately reflect the will of school boards, community partners, and families to have a say in the future of their schools and give them the opportunity to fully engage in the process of seeking partnerships to create community hubs. And they should also begin a review of the funding formula in order to make sure that school boards have funding in place to support their community schools. I'll now turn the mic over to Susan McKenzie to share her thoughts.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning. I am speaking on behalf of a grassroots organization, the Ontario Alliance Against School Closures. Within 1 month, our alliance has garnered the collective support of over 885,000 citizens who are angry and disillusioned with the actions of their school boards and the Ministry of Education. We are no longer isolated to our own communities. For those of us who have already lost schools under the revised PARG, which is the Pupil Accommodation Review Guideline, we know firsthand that the process is rigged. We have been brushed off, we've been scolded, insulted, and ignored by our school boards because we exercised our democratic right to challenge the data. True absenteeism is common at ARC meetings. Trustee absenteeism is common at ARC meetings. Their attendance is voluntary. We have powerless ARCs representing school communities when it is the elected trustee who should be the conduit and accountable to our concerns, yet they are silent. There is no longer meaningful interdependence between trustees, board administrators, and the ministry. We have discovered that the pupil accommodation review process is merely a facade. By removing the considerations of a school's value to its community and to its local economy, the revised PARG has changed the dynamics of the review process. Eliminating these two key components has not only soured community and municipal trust, it successfully disregards all citizen input. These are not reviews to engage the community and the municipality. These are predetermined closures. A vicious cycle has evolved where no elected body wants to be accountable. 1 in 8 schools is being considered for closure. This equates to 600 schools, with the majority in rural Ontario. One could argue that it would be more fiscally responsible to maintain the top-up funding than to maintain abandoned properties this government will bestow upon our school boards. The ministry's PARG states that school boards must respond to changing demographics when in fact it is this government creating the demographic change. Families move to small communities and rural areas so they can experience an enriched sense of identity. It is a circumstance of discrimination when one is stripped of their lifestyle choice. This government will effectively kill the holistic function of schools in rural Ontario and in vulnerable communities. Reputable companies such as Chapman's Ice Cream in Markdale and Ross Video in Iroquois have been very vocal about the impact school closures will have on their businesses. It will be a struggle for them to retain good employees, and it will deter any expansion because families will not be attracted to areas without schools. When combined, the PARG and funding formula creates a move away from small schools, giving preference to large schools, meaning rural students will spend increased hours on a school bus. For example, in the Greater Sudbury area, students who already endure long daily commutes will be on the bus in excess of 4 hours a day when their schools close. The time for supper, homework, play, and adequate rest will be secondary to their well-being. There will be no time for extracurricular activities or after-school jobs. Premier Wynn suggests we share our views with the school board if we already haven't done so. We are here to tell her that we have shared our views. This government and our school boards have not been listening. Shame on them for disrupting the lives of so many families, hoping we would sit idle and isolated. The Honourable Mitzi Hunter tells us solutions won't be found at Queen's Park. We're not here looking for solutions, we are here to deliver solutions, because this war on Ontario communities must come to an end. To arrive at an equitable and democratic pupil accommodation review process that is truly inclusive, we call for the Ministry of Education to place an immediate moratorium on all school closures, suspend all pupil accommodation reviews until the PARG is subjected to an all-party review and rewritten to include meaningful and transparent consultation with stakeholders impacted by school closures. The PARG is fundamentally wrong on all levels because it is the result of bad planning and bad policy. If the government remains on this path, it will forever change the lives of our families and hollow out our communities. This government does not respect that schools are public assets. We own them. We must have a say in how our children are educated in them. We are here seeking positive change. Make the school closure process a social contract between all involved to ensure it is the right decision, and that if there is a school closure, schools and communities will not be abandoned. In December 2003, under the Liberal government, the ministry asked school boards for a moratorium on school closures while they developed a new PARG. The moratorium lasted 3 years. The Ontario Alliance Against School Closures, supported by over 885,000 voters, is calling on the ministry to once again ask school boards for an immediate moratorium on school closures. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And at this time, we'll take questions.